Good evening from Vietnam, Dr. Eliza. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon joining my Inside Sharing show and sharing your story with us and the audience in Vietnam. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Great to be here.
Well, Eliza, in the cultural way, is it best for our audience if we can have you to do the introduction of who you are and the work that you do? Can you help to do that for us, please?
Of course, I'm Dr. Eliza Filby, and I'm a historian and what's called a generations expert. And I study the different generations and how they are evolving and emerging as different workers, consumers, and citizens. And most of my research is focused right now on work and having four generations, some places five generations in the workplace. And I help companies, governments, and charities understand these changing demographics and these different generational values in order for them to help run their business or their institution or their government in a more informed way.
Wow. And we have 377 experts joining the show, ranging from very different background. You're the first person, the expert in generations. So, uh, Dr. Eliza, allow us to understand, why you choose to do this career. So, we're gonna bring you all the way to when you were young. Okay. So, when you were young, what did you dream one day when you grow up? You're gonna do. You're gonna become, what kind of job, what kind of role you're gonna add into the work.
So I grew up in a home that was very surrounded by books, but even more importantly, family had grown up and owned that house. My grandfather won it in a card game. He was a gambler, and he won it in a card game, and he put the house deeds in my grandmother's name, so he couldn't gamble it again. And his family's heirlooms and books and things like that, and my grandmother's family heirlooms and books and things like that. And then my dad was born in that house and indeed died in the same house. And it was just full of stuff. It was full of history through newspapers, old books, old paintings, old photographs, costumes. I mean, it was just an extraordinary museum to the past. And also through the generations of my family. So it's no surprise to me that I did my first degree in history at university, trying to understand the past and my place in it, I think. And then also I did my PhD in history. And I was particularly interested in the 1980s because I was interested in a period in British history that had been quite tumultuous because Margaret Thatcher had been Prime Minister, and it was a very disruptive decade. And I wanted to understand the period in which I had been born and how it had shaped my generation. So I did my PhD on the 1980s, and then I wrote a book on that PhD. But I kind of felt I worked in academia. I worked at King's College London. I taught in China. I taught a number of universities across the UK, and I came to the conclusion that for a lot of academics, they love that discussion and that engagement with other academics, and they loved obviously disseminating that to students. I was more interested in disseminating my research to a broader audience beyond the academy. So I then ventured out on my own and set up my own business, really marketing myself as someone that could help businesses understand how the world was changing. And I've been doing that for 3 years now. And essentially, I've made the job up, really. But it combines my passions, which is a passion for understanding the past, the present, and thinking about the future, a passion for generations and family and changing dynamics within society and values. But it's also really practical. and using research to help find solutions.
I wrote a article shared by you. Say generational analysis is about understanding how we are all part of our time. I don't kind of quite understand about that. Can you share that with me, please?
So it comes from this idea that, if we're talking about generations, we're really talking about family, because that's where it makes most sense, right?
Mm,
And it's the place where the generational idea has meaning.
mm,
And I'm both a daughter, but I'm also a mother, and I'm
mm,
sandwiched between those two generations. And for me, as I engage with both ends of the generational spectrum, I'm increasingly aware that we are all just a product of our time. And it's not about saying this generation is lazy, or this generation is entitled, or this generation is out of touch, or this generation is conservative. It's actually just recognizing
mm,
in our workspaces, in our families, in our political engagement, we have to get away from ageism and
mm,
saying, the young are indulgent and disruptive unnecessarily and have short attention spans, and all these kind of lazy generalizations that the old have about the young have about also the old. And I just think we need to get away from that, and almost learn, if we're a manager in a business, or even if we're a mother to a 5-year-old son,
mm,
to step out of our own time and say, okay, there's a reason why Netflix is boring to him, because he was born with it. It's
mm.
almost does not have the same allure to my son that it has to me, because he's just used to it. And actually trying to understand that and learn and empathize with different generations because of that, I think, is incredibly important thing to do in society. Whether it's looking at a baby boomer or someone in their 60s and 70s and realizing that in Vietnam, or they went through a certain period in your nation's history, through war, through political disruption, through revolution and upheaval, and how that has shaped that generation, those in their 60s and 70s now, and helping the young people, the 9X generation in Vietnam, to understand what that was like, and to understand what that meant for not your country, but actually just people's everyday lives. And that's what I mean by we have to transcend our time, because actually what that is about creating empathy, understanding, and bringing the generations together. And it's as important in the workplace as it is in the family.
Mm. Dr. Eliza, a lot of my audience are business leaders and HR professionals. So their role is to create workforce where it can create equal opportunity for everybody, and gender and diversity, and like generation inclusion, and things like that, right? But we do see a lot of pressure on organizations these days regarding to fill the gap of generations. Like there's a lot of new generation getting into the workforce and create a lot of like unbalance in the people strategy. So in your in your world of work, how can we create an organization that can embrace the differences between vast generation, from baby boomer to the X to the millennials, and to the Generation Z, though?
So I think that companies have to get used to the fact that age diversity is increasingly a core challenge within businesses. And you've got a generation coming through, the 9X generation, who have grown up with obviously not just a smartphone in their pocket, but that social media comparison culture that is really conditioning their view of work. And in a country like Vietnam, that is a huge, huge break from, say, those in their 60s and 70s, or even like the Gen Xers within Vietnam, because transition has been so disruptive and so huge, arguably even more so than places like the UK, the US. But still, the problem persists, right? So we need to make sure in our workplaces we are bringing the generations together. And in a society where we need older workers to keep working, we have to accept that a multi-generational workplace is the future and also is the present. So what can we do? The first is we need to bring the generations together. So how can we help them understand each other? How can we help them understand the time in which they've grown up and lived and experienced life? And there are fundamental differences, and those are about sharing those stories and those experiences. And I think that's really, really important. The second thing is to put policies in place that disincentivizes ageism, particularly in management. So the importance that is placed in managers and leaders, but managers especially, to really give, particularly to younger generations, a level of respect. Because what you're talking about actually is age equality in the workplace rather than just age diversity. It used to be that young people come into work with no knowledge and really no kind of certainly technological skills, and yet sometimes now you've got generation coming through who have more knowledge of technology and better skills than those that have been in the company for say 20-30 years. So that idea of there being this hierarchy within companies, or that deference culture where you're subservient to your boss because he knows more than you, is actually not true anymore. It is true to a certain extent, but not in the same way that it once was. You've also got a generation coming through that have grown up on social media and are much more well versed in what other people are doing at work, what other options are there in terms of career, what other jobs are available, and also the capacity to speak truth to power all the time. So what you must do is put policies in place that help those generations create a more democratic atmosphere, if I'm honest, a more flatlined rather than hierarchical structure of difference. So what can you do? I've seen companies do really clever things with reverse mentoring, skills swapping across the generations. I've seen companies introduce management training for those of the younger generation, helping them manage older generations, and also specific training for older generations that are exclusively looking after younger teams and trying to bridge that gap. But more fundamentally as well, I think we need to recognize that the world of work is changing because for all sorts of reasons, gender equality, the fact that we're having fewer babies and we're having them closer together and we're having them later in life, is really conditioning women's engagement in the workforce, but also their husband's engagement in the family.
Yeah.
The fact that we're living longer, and if we're living longer, does retirement look slightly differently? If we're living, into our 90s, do we really conceivably think we can retire in the mid-60s? And if we're working longer, maybe out of want or need, do we then need to treat our older workers differently? Do we then need to be thinking, how do we upskill them? How do we keep them agile? Because also within all of this, we've got a working landscape that is disrupted continually by technology. And so as good as it is that we've started to send more and more people to university, actually we need to have people continually learning throughout their working life, because 21st century working life is about agility and keeping up to date and upskilling throughout that working life. So I think we tend to overly focus on young people because young people are cheap, right? They're agile, but actually it's looking at that workforce in the round in a multi-generational lens.
I've been doing research a lot with the not the baby boom to be said, but it's the Generation X, and there's a lot of
Mhm.
pressure from them, and also a lot of stereotyping, coming from this generation, talking about, the next generations of the workforce. And you're the author of a lot of article regarding to unlocking the future workforce generation, for workforce.
Mm.
So, what is that future workforce be defined by you?
So I think in terms of Gen X, just to comment on that for a moment, because I think it's really important to reflect on in the West, there is predominantly a boomer backlash. And in
Mm,
respect to the boomers, they really are the exceptional generation who made enough money and acquired enough assets, not all of them, but a quite significant amount of them in the West, and had quite a privileged generation. In in say places like Vietnam, China, um, you could say Southeast Asia, South Asia. What you're really talking about there is the Generation X that were the ones who were the great opportunists, had certain opportunities as countries were opening up,
mm,
embracing global trade and capitalism, and opening up to the world. It was Gen X that had the opportunities. And I think now obviously company leaders, CEOs, and running the show. And in many respects, I think for Gen X, they are almost more fortunate because they have Gen Z children. So they're
mm,
more likely to understand Gen Zers than baby boomers, who by and large have millennial children. So I think Gen X, though, are the ones that were the real grafters, the ones that were really, trying to take all these opportunities that the opening up of your country and other parts of that world, taking those opportunities, and then they see Gen Z who take those opportunities for granted and are like, you don't know how hard we worked. You don't know how much we had to. You don't know what life used to be like. And then there's the disconnect, which is really troubling. Is you've got the generation coming through, who see this progress and these opportunities as natural and as a right, not as something to be earned.
mm,
And I think that causes a lot of tension. In China, you're seeing something called the lying down movement, the desire to not work at all, and that rejection by Gen Z in China of that kind of overworking culture, and many interesting initiatives from trying to ban video game usage and trying to ban tutoring is indications, I think, of a broader emphasis on realizing that with the millennials, what happened in China is that there was such an emphasis to get to university. That's how the world will open up to you. That's how the opportunities of China will unfold to you. And I think in China, they're probably, light years ahead of everywhere else, realizing that for the 21st century, different skills are needed. And the birth rate is dropping, and the importance of family life, the importance of burnout and not overworking. The state is trying to institutionalize against those trends and phenomena. And I think you're seeing a similar story in a less, I think, aggressive and vigorous form in the West, where birth rate is low, gender equality is rising, social inequality is rising. People are wanting different things out of work and what they expect work to look like. The pandemic accelerated worker burnout and an emphasis on mental health. and different, the pandemic triggered conversations that were actually already happening, which was people reassessing the place of work in their lives. And that's really tricky for older generations to comprehend, because they're like, well, this is what we did when we were your age. In fact, we did it more. So why are you complaining of burnout?
And Dr. Eliza, since you've been writing your first book in 2015, and is there any exciting new books you are writing to introduce to the world?
Yes, I'm currently writing a collection of essays, which is hoping to address some of the stuff around multi-generational workplaces, but actually also it's about things like, what does an aging society look like? Everyone talks about the aging society like it's an old people's problem, but actually it's a young people's problem. And various essays on things like inheritance, which is becoming more and more of an issue, and how you alleviate, if you've got a society that is governed by inheritance, you have a problem, because it's essentially a situation where people earn whose life chances are more determined by what they inherit than what they earn. And that is very problematic. How do you incentivize workers when essentially their wage isn't going to compete with someone's inheritance? How do you make promises as a politician when essentially their inheritance is more important than any tax incentives or state subsidies you can give through their wages? So in the West in particular, we're a tipping point of an inheritance economy. So I'm writing a piece on that at the moment. And this is an edited collection of essays that I'm hoping will shed light and give insight into one of the critical issues of our time, which is that demographic disruption, that change in values across the generations, and what the future holds, particularly for Gen Z, but potentially for the generation after the Gen Zs, which is Generation Alpha, which is my kids' generation.
Yep, I think that the pandemic actually accelerated a lot of changes around the world, right? And one of that change is it's pull out what we start to feel like really matters. So, as something is important now, it's no longer important or less important than it used to be, right? So I'm interested to know, and to look from the findings that you found also, Dr. Eliza. And a lot of our leaders in Southeast Asia have this question that they would like me to ask you, because they do, we've been training corporations, employees a lot on, intelligence, like IQ, EQ, and stuff like that. And you term the coin generational intelligence, we call it GQ, right? And they believe, as a business leaders, as a senior managers, they need to master this intelligence so that they can, come to the workforce and work harmonize with everybody, and can build a working environment that, different generations will feel welcoming, and it's an art that, leaders need to master. Okay, so when you wrote about, generation intelligence, what did you mean about that, and how can we build that skill up?
So it's a great question, and I think IQ, EI, and GQ, as you've said, are actually almost like three components of leadership, because in a way, and I don't need to explain IQ or probably EQ, but GQ is like what you're basically trying to understand is the individual, not the generation, but the individual, and how they have been shaped by particular things. Because you can understand them by gender, and you can understand them by race and geography, but actually understanding them by age gives you a nuance and an insight into them and who they are that I think is critical to explaining how they will operate in the workplace. So if again, this is not about saying, oh, you're a Gen Zer, so therefore you have an attention span of 8 seconds, or you're a baby boomer and therefore you're privileged. It's about saying, it's actually about asking questions, and it's about finding those people in your companies, your offices, your teams, and just saying, oh, so hang on a minute, what were you doing? When were you at university, or were you the first cohort that graduated during the global financial crisis? Or when you entered the workplace, were there female toilets? And when you entered the workplace, was there a dress code and you could only wear skirts and heels? Or when you were engaged with the feminist movement, what were the kind of key components? What was the sort of... And so what you're finding out essentially is how they've been conditioned by time. And so therefore when you're engaging with them as individuals, you're not engaging with them as generational stereotypes. You're actually trying to understand them as people and their lived experience. And in lived experience in respect to work, but also, in respect to home. A lot of people in the workplace who the idea of dual income households and of the father changing a nappy, right, is totally alien. And actually, we do this in our families all the time. And it's time we did it in our workplaces, because actually for young people born in the 1990s or noughties, they don't have a clue. And maybe they do, but actually finding out is really important. And so I think it's just that idea of, okay, what time were you shaped by it? And that helps me understand how much I need to come to you on a certain thing. That helps me understand what references I can make. What language should I use? and also helps me understand you as an individual as well. And I'm not saying it's the only thing, but it is one of the most important things that we don't do enough of.
So if I want to be better at GQ, what is that? What is the skill that I need to be learning so that I can be effectively, improve my GQ?
You need to be asking questions and listening.
Asking questions and listening. And Dr. Eliza, if we get into too much of individual, question about the individual preferences, where can we find the line to respect, like the boundaries or personal boundaries? And because in the Eastern culture,
it's a good question, and I'm not suggesting you probe into people's personal lives. I'm actually just, when you're confronted with someone who is working on a project, say, and you want to know their approach to this project, asking questions about how, where did they learn their approach, and what was the way in which they, or the entry level into that company where they learn a particular culture, a work culture. What was the scenario when they had their first day at work? When my mum had her first day at work, there were no female toilets in the company because there were no females in the company. She had to go across the road to the shop. So it's saying, okay, this person is of a different time, and let me understand that time, so actually we can work better together.
But if we change over the time also, how can leaders and managers keep track of personal preferences and values over time?
Yeah, and I think that's true. And I think, it's in a work context, is that we are all agile, moldable beasts. and we do change, and actually we're more likely to change if we engage in GQ, because we are going to learn different ways of doing things. What a mobile phone does is it silos everyone, and it assumes, or it gets you to assume, that the world looks like you, and the world is this monoculture that kind of is refracted back into you, to you through your phone. But of course, we all need to engage much more with others that are not like us, and in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of race, but also in terms of age. And when it comes to the workplace, unfortunately, for historically, your age has determined your stage at work. And so therefore seniority is synonymous with older. And that's just not the case. That is being disrupted because you've got technical whiz kids coming in, for example, who know that much more than the seniors in the company. So that age and stage dualism is already breaking down, but it also is going to break down even more as people work longer and there are more generations in the workforce.
Dr. Eliza, my wife and I actually have the belief that our ability to think actually not increasing but decreasing. Okay, and because a lot of things happening to our lives that makes us, to think deeper is becoming harder for a lot of people. And every chance that we got a chance to talk to an expert like you are, we always love to ask how you think, because your work has been so fascinating. You've been learning about your history, and then just connecting all the dots, and just and the work that you do requires you to do a lot of thinking, deep thinking. All right. So how do you think? Can you have shared that?
Because I think one of the things that I've learnt over the last probably 6 years is that yes, you can learn a lot from books, and I would hope that people would read mine, but I spend a lot of my time observing just people and society and social media, and like a novelist would, I suppose, observing human behavior, observing just quirkiness, strange different uses of imagery and language and different things where you think, oh, hang on a minute, that's different. And why is that? So it's not just that it's observing differences, but also questioning why. So whether you think about Gen Z women and how they've upended fashion in many respects, you look at the way in which Gen Z women are not wearing high heels in the same way and to the same degree as previous women. Why is that? Is it a combination of a more gender neutral approach to understanding of femalehood, a part of the Me Too movement and the sort of third wave of feminism? Is it part of just the development in music and fashion? Is it also a reflection of the pandemic and the fact that we're working from home? So there's that boundary between work and play and work uniform and non-work uniform breaking down. Now, that's just, I'm just riffing here, but the broader point is that I spend a lot of my time not necessarily looking in books, but looking at the world around me. And I'm fortunate to be working in a time where I don't just have to observe people on my streets near my home in South London, but because we're online, I can observe the world. And one of the things that I deliberately do is keep my sources of information and my connections very broad, and are forever looking and trying to find new sources, new conversations, new representations of something bigger. So it's observing and then going, why? What's happened with that? What's happened to that?
Thanks a lot for sharing that experience from you. And yes, observing people and learning things outside of the books and ask the question why, so that we can dig in deeper and start
Hmm.
to connecting things around us using our ability to think and imagine, right? So,
Right.
yes, yeah. Dr. Eliza, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with me and the audience of the Inside Sharing Show. And you never been to my country, so the next time you get a chance to go to Southeast Asia with your son and your family, please, you can put me down to the list. We will be here waiting, and we'll be so happy to take you guys around town and show out the
Do you know
country.
what? A, that sounds amazing. B, I think one of the things that I have really a desire to do, and hopefully an opportunity to do quite soon, is explore that part of the world. I taught in China, in Beijing back in 13, 14, and I loved it. And I need to spend more time in Asia because, in many respects, when we're talking about generations, it's global, but it's also so local. And I don't spend enough time traveling, particularly as I have a young family. But that's when you can really observe not just the generational differences, but crucially, obviously, the geographical differences, and and it's just something that I need to spend more time doing. So yes, that would be lovely.
Wonderful, wonderful. We will look forward to that day, Eliza. And thanks a lot for everything that you shared with us today. I wish you all the best. And please say hello to your family for us. Okay?
Can I just say also, I really appreciate the intelligence with which you've answered and composed your questions, because they show a real interest and an enthusiasm and a curiosity for my subject. So very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You have a beautiful day there, right?
You too. Take care.
You take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.